Hi, everyone, and welcome to our inaugural reading for the Creative Writing Program online. I'm Laura Cronk. I'm faculty of the Creative Writing Program, and it's my honor to welcome Honor Moore, who will be reading from her brand new book, Our Revolution, A Mother and Daughter at Midcentury. I'm going to give some formal remarks, and we're going to see a short video, and then we'll hear from Honor, who will read to us. We're thrilled that you're joining us via live stream. This is our first time trying this out, and we're so happy to welcome you. My favorite way to consider the concept of motherhood is to think of the word mothering, to remember that it's a verb. Mothering doesn't require guardianship of human children. People of any gender can mother. Mothering is work, but it is sacred work in that it requires a quality of deep attention, is tenacious and generous. There is also often a quality of ferocity in mothering, birds pushing fledglings out of nests. We can want to be mothered, and we can mother all at once. This is work that doesn't end. Our Revolution, A Mother and Daughter at Midcentury, is a book about a mother and a daughter, and is of course a book about motherhood and daughterhood, but it's also about transformation, creation, grief, connection. This is a hybrid book, part deeply researched biography, part intuitive lyrical memoir, part critical read of the cultural moment that birthed civil rights and women's freedom in this country. I met Honor Moore in the spring of 2003 when I was a graduate student in her literature course in poetry and translation. We read contemporary Chinese poetry, French poetry. I was introduced to Marina Tsvetaeva and Paul Celan and Rainier Maria Rilke. I think back at all I didn't know and all I was learning. I remember that Honor embraced my way of learning, led by feeling. It was exactly the class I needed. I think it was perhaps exactly the class all of us needed. I remember the feeling of our little group somehow levitating just a bit with the intensity of our work. There was something else happening in synchronicity with our class. Honor's father, the Bishop Paul Moore, was dying. I believe he died right before the end of the semester, just when we were reading from the book Something Black by the French poet Jacques Roubaud, a book he wrote in grief after losing his wife. Of course, Honor had not yet written her groundbreaking book about her father, the bishop's daughter. I don't think the class grasped who the world had just lost, just that our teacher had lost her beloved father. Honor advised my thesis project and has remained a mentor to me since. As families pass down heirlooms, I'm grateful for the writers that my teachers have passed down to me. Honor passed down Edna St. Vincent Millay. I learned reading this book that Vincent had been passed down to Honor from her own mother. Along with the gifts of writers she's passed down to me, I hope that I've picked up some of her tenacity as well. For example, teaching in the face of personal crisis, or turning a book launch event into an online celebration as the world faces a pandemic. Teaching is a thread that runs through Our Revolution. Using the lens of teaching allows so many astute and moving moments in the book to unfold. Ambition and competition also thread through the stories of Jenny Moore's and Honor Moore's lives. If wanting to be the best was part of the reason for Jenny Moore to have a brood of 9 children, aren't they marvelous, she asked, knowing they were, with a winning smile. I wonder how Honor Moore stacks up, having mothered, in some sense, hundreds of emerging writers with her teaching and the example of her fine work. Honor is the author of 3 books of poems, Memoir, Darling, and Red Shoes, and 2 other nonfiction books, The White Blackbird about her grandmother, the Painter Margarett Sargent, and The Bishop's Daughter, a memoir about her father, Paul Moore. She's won countless fellowships and awards, including the Guggenheim Fellowship, and is faculty and nonfiction coordinator of the Graduate Writing Program here at the New School. I'm so pleased that we get the chance to celebrate the publication of Our Revolution today. This is a strange moment we find ourselves in, and I don't know about you, but I'm especially hungry for stories of courage and reinvention. I'm so eager to have Honor read for us. Just to let you know what the structure of this event will be, we're going to watch a short animation produced by Parsons alum Alyssa Shea, and then Honor will read 5 short passages, and in between each passage, she and I will talk, and after that, we'll field your questions. There's a a chat function in the live stream. So at any point that a question occurs to you, you can type it in the chat, and we will get those questions and we'll be able to address them at the end. So now we're going to show the original animation and book trailer for Our Revolution, created by Alyssa Shea.
Great. Oh, that was beautiful.
For those of you just joining us, I'm Laura Cronk of the New School's Creative Writing Program, and we're here with Honor Moore discussing her brand new book, Our Revolution, A Mother and Daughter at Midcentury. So now I'd like to turn the floor over to you, Honor, and ask you, number one, if you could share a little bit about the animation that we just saw, and then read the first section that you're going to share with us.
Okay. Last spring, I was finishing the book. I was finishing the semester with my thesis students and my students, and I had a photo deadline for the book, and I called up Laura, or emailed Laura Cronk, and I said, Laura, do you know someone at Parsons who could find someone for me to help me organize the photographs for my book? I just need another eye. I can't do it alone. And who should, to my wondering eyes, should appear, and I mean that because she appeared first with her thesis video, which is beautiful, but Alyssa Shea. And she was recommended by Jess Irish at Parsons, and she showed up at my apartment, and it took us about 10 minutes to realize that probably we'd known each other in another life. We felt just completely in tune. We sort of worked on photographs, and then I said, could you do a PowerPoint, photographs for a PowerPoint for me too? And then I thought, no, not a crummy PowerPoint. You're an animator and a video artist. What about a video? Now, all the stuff you saw in the video are the materials of my book. My mother left me her unfinished writing in her will. I had just started to publish when I was 27 and she died. And she kept 25 years worth of scrapbooks, which I photographed and photographed and photographed. And I had tons of photographs, and I had all this writing, and I had photographed a lot of it, and Alyssa made it into that incredible thing that you just saw. And so Alyssa Shea, yes.
It's just stunning.
What?
It's just stunning.
It is. It's so beautiful. And it's so, my siblings, I sort of previewed it to some of my siblings. My sister said, I just can't stop watching it. And I cry every time I watch it. I mean, maybe we're kind of special to the material, but anyway, thank you, Alyssa. I'm going to start with a reading from the first section of the book, which is a kind of prologue. The woman who comes to me in dreams is not my real mother, or she is my real mother now and has been since she appeared in that bright green field. I was 27 and she had not yet died, but she would within weeks. The green of the field was so vivid. Usually in dreams, there is no color, and she does not speak clearly to me, though her voice can come to me now in daylight, if I'm vacuuming, for instance. Life is too short, she says, one of those phrases of hers. Can't you get someone to help? Not exactly her voice, but the movement of her voice and the expression, the slight irony that tells me there are other things to which I might apply myself, which is strange, since in life she was always telling me to clean up my room. My mother collected relics of the female past, framed embroideries of Victorian peens to motherhood, stitched samplers and the like, which she hung in the downstairs bathroom or on the way up the stairs, right next to photographs of my father marching with Martin Luther King, or of herself posing with some of the street kids she worked with in Jersey City. She liked the irony. She was a bishop's wife and mother of 9 who didn't look the part, who wore bright colors and net stockings. The prize of the collection was a print Currier and Ives published in 1850 called Life and Age of Woman. Because it hung on the wall of my mother's bedroom during the last month of her life, I had a lot of time to puzzle over it, over what stage she had reached and what lay ahead for me. Woman's life begins in her mother's arms, and 1 step up the arch with stairs, she's a girl with a doll. 2 steps and she's marriageable, holding an embroidery hoop. Next, she's a bride, hair streaming to her waist, then a young mother with an infant. At the apex stands the matron in her prime, wearing black, a white tea towel over her arm. This is the last we see of the woman standing fully upright, and the last of her crowning glory, as all 4 women on the descent, holding keys on a ring, bending over a cane, knitting, rocking, wear white ruffled caps that cover their hair. This life cycle had nothing to do with me. This was 1973, and I wore my hair down nearly to my waist. Would I even enter into marriage, an institution of which, after 3 years of consciousness raising, I was increasingly skeptical? My mother rarely wore black and would have framed the tea towel. But otherwise, she was certainly as upright and confident as the matron at the top of that pyramid. If she dies, I thought to myself, she will never have to get old like the crone in the rocker whose nose almost reaches her chin. My mother came of age nearly 100 years after the print was published at the end of World War II. At 21, she threw in her lot with a Marine hero bound for the Episcopal ministry, and for the next 17 years was enthusiastically and almost always pregnant, while always dreaming of doing something else. She may have been born into those Currier and Ives prescriptions, but for her generation, those ideas were as quaint as black bombazine, as bygone as Whistler's mother, for God's sake. My mother dreamed of an old age, free of all of us, and onto a future all her own. Her life would not descend from a central height of maternal satisfaction, but would rise further, making another arc and another, a double, even a triple rainbow.
Thank you so much. I'm hearing the room applaud in virtual space. That was beautiful. You really cover so much ground in that prologue, and not only do we get an overview of what you're going to cover in the book, we also get this great introduction to the kind of hybrid nature of the book. You begin with this beautiful vision, and I think we don't often think about the use of the imagination in nonfiction. It's very clearly linked with fiction, but I'd love to hear about how you approached incorporating fantasies and imagined scenes and visions from dreams, like that element of the imaginative work that you do in this book. If you could just tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I am also a poet, and the origin of my work is in poetry. And one of the things about a poem is how to fit all different kinds of stuff into a poem. And so I had training in that. And when I came to prose, it was kind of natural to want to do the same thing. along with this idea that I had that you have to tell a story by any means necessary. How are you going to get that the daughter is haunted by the mother if you don't have her appear as a ghost? It's pretty boring to say, oh, my mother haunted me. You know, it doesn't mean anything really. And I also remember seeing a movie, some French movie. It had Belmondo in it in the 70s, in the early 70s. And I remember having this idea. I suddenly got how an image can move along narrative. In other words, an image is like a bunch of sentences or a paragraph or, you know, a bunch of, you know, facts. And it can move along narrative. So I started having the idea that I could make, then I was just writing poems, I could make images that moved narrative. Does that make
that's
sense?
incredible. And that's so useful, I think, for all of us on this live stream who are writers. So it was movies that taught you that.
In a
some way.
movie, and this idea by any means necessary.
Yeah.
To tell this story by any means necessary. And in this case, part of this telling the story was writing the book, which was difficult. I weave into the book my mother's writing. And I don't like just insert blocks of quotes. I weave it into the story. So you don't, if you were hearing it, you don't notice in a way, or it stealthily comes up on you. And so the book was difficult to write. It was arduous. And it also took 7 years. And I found it necessary to every once in a while check in with myself. Like there's a point at which I say, because it just seemed, would these people please get married? I mean, they're corresponding for like, you know, a year by mail because he's in the West Coast for the war and they break up and they get back together and finally I just wrote it down. I said, I've been trying to get my parents married for months. You know, it's just because I thought it would, if the reader is getting a little frustrated with them, they should know that I too am getting frustrated.
Well, and it's also, as a writer, it's fascinating to get to follow you on the journey of writing the book. But I think even for anyone who just loves a good story, it's so interesting to follow what you're going through as you're trying to track this and piece it together. But those moments where you do kind of burst through and share your own frustration that you're trying to get them married and what's going on. And those are so effective in the book. And it does feel seamless. One more question about the passage you just read, that image of the Currier and Ives print. It just felt like this, it was a perfect symbol. And it's like sly and poignant. So we get so much about your mother in that very short paragraph about, you know, the irony she felt toward this kind of domesticity, even while she's being constrained by it, the sadness that she isn't going to get to live out the full cycle that's illustrated there. And then this glorious triple rainbow. And there seems to be a series of threes that appear in the book. And I feel the connection between you, your mother, and your grandmother kind of circling and hovering. That was such a beautiful image.
Well, sometimes these images just come and I tell my students, I still just write, because, and just let it happen, and then worry later whether it's too corny or something, and the triple rainbow, I'm just like spinning out, at my computer. And I thought, why not a triple rainbow?
And how did you come to the Currier and Ives idea? Was that just spending so much time in memory in your childhood home, or how did that appear?
It was there, I thought about it, I was thinking about her dying. And I remember I wrote it, I was at Hedgebrook, the writers' colony for women on Whidbey Island in Washington State. And I was starting this book. It was like, how am I going to do it? And so I just went online and I found the Currier and Ives, which I which we had, which she actually did have on her bedroom wall. I mean, I didn't make that up. And, and as I had learned with writing The White Blackbird, I sort of wrote a version of the image, and then I, cut it down. And then later, much later, years later, toward the end of the book, I realized, the book actually is, if you read the table of contents, it actually is a revised Currier and Ives. It's a different life cycle. It has in it, for instance, there is a chapter called First Person Singular.
Yeah.
And that's when she comes into her I voice.
Yeah, which is kind of the pinnacle.
Yeah.
So for those of you just joining us, I'm Laura Cronk from the New School Creative Writing Program. We're here with Honor Moore, who's reading from and discussing her brand new book, Our Revolution. And Honor, I believe you're going to read a bit more for us, if that's right.
Okay, so I mentioned that I had her writing, and I obviously had her adult writing, and I had the memoir she was dictating as she was dying. But then I ended up with childhood writing. They were, she and her 3 siblings were homeschooled. At the time it was called tutored, because my grandmother just thought schools, all the possible schools were just wretched. And so she was going to have her kids, learn Latin and Greek and French and how to write. And anyway, so that's the background. I am picturing my mother as a girl of 12 sitting at her desk. There is a sheet of blank paper, a bottle of ink, and she is bent over the paper, holding her pen. Ink, she writes, is the most splendid thing to use with a pen on paper. On the floor or on the table, it's wicked. On the tablecloth, it's worse. Mostly it's better to keep it in a bottle. It may be better to keep the ink in the bottle, but today she will not. She is holding a pen, and she believes herself a poet. I had no idea. Only a decade after her death did I look at the loose-leaf notebook of the poems the children had written for their teacher, John Neri. Only decades after that did I see that my mother's poems were actual poems. When my first was accepted for publication, she complimented me again and again, but she never told me she'd written poems as a child. Did she even remember? I want to imagine how she feels as she writes, a fresh page on the small desk, the pen in her hand. I think of her dreaming and seeing green hills, and all the hills she sees are thick with trees. But because today she is a poet, she believes it is her privilege and her task to alter what she sees. So she strips the trees away. You can't see the forest for the trees. Makes one hill bare, unprotected, a blank, and writes a first line, on a bare hill. The manuscript before me was typewritten before it was sent off to her parents. So it's impossible to make out whether Jenny pauses to consider the hill before she writes again. On a bare hill, 3 trees. She chooses to leave space after 3 trees so that one's imagination rests in the open space after the comma. I recognize that quiet waiting. 3 trees. How double sets of double E's make long sounds. So what you hear then is E, then E's, the S leading to another S until something offers the word sway. And within sway, a long A, and then to extend time, you add ing. On a bare hill, 3 trees swaying. What happens now? What about letting another ing displace the way in sway? Yes, on a bare hill, 3 trees swaying and singing. Now the trees have nearly come to life as each time she writes a poem, she herself comes to life, a life solitary and more vivid than the ordinary, even though others see just Jenny bent over her desk writing. It is early spring and she dips the pen again in the ink and she hears from outdoors actual wind, the tiny sound of a twig knocking against another twig, branch against branch. Or she is just making up the wind. the short eyes within hill and sing, resounding as to her amazement comes bickering. What the married couple she and her sister invent every night are always doing. In the wind, bickering. And women do it too, not the kind of woman she wants to be, but jealous, silly women and girls in dressing rooms before a dance, powdering their faces. But now, as she listens, the sound opens into light repartee, exchange that scampers and trips. 3 trees swaying and singing, in the wind, bickering, bantering. Through dressing room walls, she can actually see them. Girls, no, trees, 3 trees becoming girls, women, all of them on a dance floor as again she dips her pen, hears it scratch, swoosh along the good thick paper, and her ear alive with desire for that short eye. Hill, ing, sing, wind, bicker prevails, and she chooses it again, writing not swoosh, swoosh, but swish in the wind, bantering, bickering as they swish their skirts. Now her trees are dancers dressed to whirl. What a delight. How a skirt makes the tree a girl, a woman. Daphne returning human from the tree Apollo turned her into, arriving in the mind of this girl at the desk in Massachusetts, who is deep in her poem. One in taffeta, she is called Elm, so deep in her poem that another dancer is summoned. Her name is Maple. On a bare hill, 3 trees swaying and singing, in the wind, bantering, bickering as they swish their skirts. One in taffeta, she is called Elm. One in velvet, Maple is she. Now the 3 trees multiply as if by mirrored walls, skirts swishing, elm and maple waiting, so that the entrance of the 3rd tree, Pine, is rather startling. Pine was in tweeds. At first, just a contrast to taffeta and velvet, until with a dip of her pen, the poet announces a gentleman. And still hearing the twirl of in skirt, writes, Pine was in tweeds as he flirted with Elm. There is no break after Maple, no pause whatsoever, just a tiny echo of it from bicker, Maple neglected. Because Maple stands in for the poet, she is allowed dignity, the consolation of hands, of folding her hands, and rolled out in a ballast of vowels, the poem's finale. 3 trees. On a bare hill, 3 trees swaying and singing in the wind, bickering, bantering as they swish their skirts. One in taffeta, she is called Elm. Another in velvet, Maple was she. Pine was in tweeds as he flirted with Elm, and Maple, neglected, just folded her hands. Is it too easy to identify Pine with Papa? Imagine the tweeds, her father's. Elm, dressed in taffeta, with whom he flirts, Mama or Margie, and Maple, neglected, the poet. It seems to me that Jenny must often have folded her hands and entertained herself with the inner voice recorded in her poems.
Mm. That passage is just breathtaking. So for those of you just joining us, I'm Laura Cronk from the Creative Writing Program at the New School, here with Honor Moore, who's reading from her new book, Our Revolution. So that passage, it just feels like a masterclass in nonfiction writing to me, the way you inhabit the moment and you enter her childhood poem and perform a close read that's it's deeper than a close read. I don't know what to call it. But even like moment to moment, dissecting the sounds and kind of letting us kind of watch her mind work, the deep attention of her mind, even as a child. And I wondered if being a teacher is something that's allowed you entrance into other people's writing, if that's a skill that you've honed through being a teacher, or just how did you do that?
Well, I thought, how am I gonna? Well, first of all, I thought, I don't know what to write next. You know, that's always a thing that happens in books. It's like, ugh, I don't know what to do next. So that was one thing. And then I thought, how am I gonna get across these poems? And then I her writer self early, because I hadn't known she'd written early. I thought she just, wrote her book suddenly in 1968, just, out of the blue. But no. And then I close read that poem and I saw all that poem stuff in it.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought of myself as a poet. And I did think of looking over the shoulder of a student saying, look what you did. Look what the IR and the TS and the CK and look at all that stuff you're doing. But it was also, my own poet self. And then there's a way in which it's other times in the book when I'm talking about her youthful writing, I do say, if I were her teacher, as I might have been. She went to Barnard. I did teach writing once at Barnard 50 years after she was there. And so I could say, if I were her teacher, which I might have been. And then I'll say, I really liked where you did X. And so yes is the answer. I did be my teacher, but I also be my poet.
And
I'm wrong there, but I can't help it.
For all the moments in the book where you kind of think about a younger version of your mother from the lens of being a teacher, did that, I'm kind of wondering psychologically how that was helpful in writing the book. Did that provide you with like just the right amount of distance, but still kind of attention and care, or was it just something that happened kind of intuitively and you followed it?
Well, it happened intuitively, but also there's a strange thing that happens or has happened to me. I've written now 3 family books, and they're all memoirs. I mean, the book about my grandmother's actual biography, and the other 2 are memoirs of particular people. And there is a way in which they stop being your mother or your grandmother, and they start being another person. And once that happens, there's a lot of stuff you want to do with that. There's a lot of, she's this other person. So how am I going to encounter her? And, I have tons of photographs. So I'm looking at her. I have her voice in my ear. I have my younger sisters, each of whom embodies elements of her, and even my brothers embody elements of her. So I have pieces of her all around that are living, that are photographed. And then I have what my imagination is making of all those people as the subject for me to encounter. And then I think to see how my mother made her way, so I'm always looking at my students. How do they make their way? How are my younger sisters making their way? How did my younger self make my way?
And you wrote about your mother from the very start of your writing career. You wrote poems about her. You wrote the play you wrote was about her death. So is this book the first time she appeared as a character who was not your mother in your psyche as you were writing? I wondered how writing this book felt different than writing.
Well, I would say yes. I mean, to a certain extent in the play, because I had this actress playing her, so that was all of it. But the actress playing her had been in her class at Barnard. Anyway, but yes is the answer. I mean, and there was also a great difference when I was writing about her after her death. I was in my 20s. I was just starting to be a writer, and she was my dead mother. I mean, I was in grief. And part of how I got through my grief was to write to her and about her and of her and for her. Now, I mean, she died at 50. So let's say she just stayed 50. Well, I'm 74, so I could be her mother, right? I mean, I started the book when, let's say, I was 68, 69, but still I could be her mother. I could have been her mother. So she's this younger person. It's very weird and interesting. So definitely this was the first time I was her mother.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So everyone out there on live stream, we feel your presence. Thank you so much for being here.
No, really, thank you.
Honor, there are a few more passages we're hoping that you'll read to us.
Okay. I'm going to read, some of you may wonder why someone would have 9 children. So the background is, you have to remember this is the baby boom, and that my mother won horse show ribbons. So she was a competitor, right? She was an athlete competitor. Why honor? And also you might wonder how I got my name. Why honor? The competitor in my mother, I think. She called it perfectionism, the trait that had made her a binge studier and winner of horse and dog show ribbons. Their daughter, she and Paul, my father, agreed should have the most original, unexpected, most timely, most divine name of all. My mother had an aesthetic appreciation of a beautiful name, felicitous initials. When Alice Weichert, the daughter of Gagi, who took care of us as babies, married a man surnamed Vatna, my mother couldn't get over the married initials, AWV, she kept repeating. What a beautiful monogram. What both parents told me when I asked her was that they liked the name. Each had known an Honor. My mother, Honor O'Rourke, one of 2 black-haired, blue-eyed sisters at Barnard. My father, Honora Hemingway, the daughter of the farmer priest he worked for in Vermont summers before the war. And there was a historical moment. Wasn't Honor an appropriate name for the child intended to take the place of her father, become his relic should he honor his country by dying in the war's final invasion? But if Paul Moore survived, I was not to be an only child. They tossed about numbers early, maybe unconsciously. If they didn't marry, remember I told you they broke up all the time, Paul wrote Jenny in 1943, he'd send her 8 porringers, 1 for each of the children she'd have with someone else. If bad luck punished naming a child before birth, they'd have no daughters of all, just 9 sons. Why 8 or 9 rather than 5 or 6? Everyone was having children. This was the baby boom. Jenny would have the most, win a blue ribbon for the largest brood. I keep hearing her say, as if her reason for wanting 9 wasn't at all odd, a baseball team, a small orchestra. By the way, they did practice birth control. That's like important to this part of the story. Or did it have to do with love? Its renewal manifest in a different form each time a child was born, as if their story were an unfolding myth. It's something else entirely, if I think of her then, a young woman turned from study and writing to another task of authorship, the project of family, of correcting the one she was born into with her own celebratory brood. An 8th grade friend remembered coming to our house in Indianapolis for the first time, stopping to say hello to my mother, who was crouched near the driveway, planting tulip bulbs as several of the younger ones screeched past in a game of tag. You have a lot of children, my friend said. My mother turned and looked up, smiling. Aren't they marvelous? What my friend didn't know was that we were meticulously planned and contraception employed from the beginning. I might start one up spring of 47 and have it when Honor is about 2 and a month or so. I should like to have a good year with Daddy before feeling hideous again. Also, I should like to finish college, start the piano, and do some work at school before being preg again. But I will have twins next winter, if you want, darling.
It's so delicious to get to listen in on their correspondence about their excitement with all their plans for you, knowing that it's you. They have no idea the gloriousness that's to come. But also, like just getting to listen in on them talking about your name is so lovely. And you don't mention it in this book, and I'm trying to remember if you mention it in The Bishop's Daughter, but the Richard Lovelace poem that
Richard Lovelace was one of the Cavalier poets in the 17th century, and one of his lines, which was in 20 telegrams at my birth, there were no emails then, telegrams. 20 telegrams at my birth. I could not love thee, dears. The poem is called To Lucasta, Going to the Wars. I could not love thee, dear, so much. Loved I not honor more.
It's so perfect. But that poem is about someone away at war,
Right.
and choosing war,
Yeah.
which was especially poignant in this situation with your father, who elected a redeployment.
Yes.
Yeah, and it was terrifying for your mother, but also, yeah, so interesting. And thank you for reading this bit to get into her psyche about the choice to have 9 children, which today seems so shocking, and even then was surprising, I think. And later in the book, you talk about what else pregnancy and having babies might have meant to her, that it was a space of privacy. Is there anything else you'd like to add about what you think that kind of generative impulse and that creation that was involved with pregnancy and having children had to do with her writing?
Well, that was a moment I was at, again, I was at one of these wonderful writers, artist colonies. I was at Ragdale, which is in Evanston, Illinois, and I'm so grateful for that time. It happened to be very cold. I hadn't figured out how to use the thermostat, and I was freezing cold, and I was trying to figure out, I was writing about the beginning of her writing, her book, which interestingly, she read The Feminine Mystique, which came out in 1963. And in 1968, having moved house, in the middle of it, she published a book. And she had 9 children. I mean, hello? That was intense, I thought. Anyway, but I wanted to, I wasn't really thinking of making a comparison between, or resonance between writing and having children, but I've always been very interested in the I voice for women, and the woman putting herself at the center of her own narrative. And I feel that that's a kind of electric shock thing that happens. It's a jolt to put a woman at the center of her own narrative. And so I was thinking about that, and I thought, well, I'll go back to her book, which is called The People on Second Street, and I'll see, because I remembered she used the pronoun we, and I'll go back and I'll see about the I. And when does she start using the I? And I saw that she started using she had a sentence. The first time she really uses the I, she said, I was in that cast a glazed eye period of pregnancy and she talked about being sort of out of it. I mean, out of the stream of everyone else. And clearly the we voice was very different from the I voice. It was it seemed a kind of altered state. And I thought, wow, it was a refuge, I mean, in a way, pregnancy was a refuge. It was a refuge of privacy for her. And then I thought of myself writing, and how writing is a refuge of privacy. I mean, I'm not alone in that. That's what all writers feel, I think. But anyway, it was quite a moment. I mean, I was complaining after I got home that, the month there hadn't produced very much, but actually that was a gigantic revelation and very important to the book, I think.
Yeah, the apex of the story. So that leads us into the next passage that I think you were going to read for us, which is the moment where she's finishing her book.
Yes, but she was hog-tied about an ending. It had been a decade since they left Grace Church, and now at the end of 1967, the optimism of the early civil rights movement seemed in ruins. Race riots had raged for days in Newark and Detroit, and President Johnson had dispatched 4,700 Army paratroopers to assist the National Guard. She understood that poverty as well as race was an issue, and she was wary of rhetoric that claimed substantive improvement in the lives of the American poor. She had been in their houses. There might be more jobs, more amenities like telephones and better plumbing, she wrote, but the hard, unavoidable fact remains that the people on Second Street live outside the world that becomes more affluent at every turn. They are still politically powerless, groggy from television's half-truths, patronized by handouts from a grossly inefficient welfare system. We had changed none of that, she wrote, but we became part of the community. We weren't there to work the block, then leave after 2 years. Primarily, and leaving aside psychological motives from our own backgrounds, we lived on Second Street because we believed in God and the unique worth of every person. We believed in God, which I take to mean a belief in some power beyond individual human effort. The unique worth of every person is a phrase more typical of my mother. But while she may have crystallized her thinking, she still did not have an ending for the story her book told. The people on Second Street recounted and reflected on a time in the past, but what they had learned in Jersey City continued to resonate. How do you write an ending to something that is still changing your life? As so often happens to writers, her needs summoned a chance event. No one was home. My father was at the cathedral, the children out playing, when there came a knock on the door. Though he was now a grown man, not the little boy she'd known in Jersey City, she remembered him clearly. From Christmases, from hot summers, from scrawled letters, "Dear friends, I like this fresh air camp." He was a regular in kitchen table conversations about being Black, and she remembered seeing him shining shoes outside the Hudson Tube station. We talked the whole long afternoon. He was still in Jersey City, though he had gone to college for 2 years. Now 27, married and the father of 2, he was holding down 2 jobs. We talked of all the friends we both remembered, of their lives, the poverty, the rats, the housing, of his father's drinking, of how it had felt to be a Negro over the years since we had known each other so well. Was it a question she asked that prompted what came next? Before you came, we had very little hope, he was suddenly saying. You started a chain of things. There was camp and different experiences like that. And when there was nothing else to do, we could just go to Grace Church and hang around. You were the first white people we didn't hate. There was love and care for a long time. He hesitated before getting up to leave. I must have looked startled because he touched my arm as we sat on the sofa and went on to explain. You're too hard on yourself. You mean you didn't know people remember the love? Anyone could tell you. Even the guys who don't give a damn about God will admit that when you pin them down. She had her ending, but she must have known how quickly such a moment passes because she closed the book with a date, Washington, D.C., 1967. She didn't know that time itself was changing.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone out there who's still with us. We're so glad to have you in our homes at this live stream celebration of Honor Moore's Our Revolution. Honor, that passage is so interesting for a number of reasons. One of them, that the scene she's describing in Jersey City feels like it could have been written yesterday. The growing inequality, the gentrification, the misinformation and the poorly run systems. So that was poignant to see that it's still held. One thing I wanted to ask about, and I know that she reckoned with this, and I don't know how, it seems like almost by magic she reckoned with it. But in thinking about our own blind spots as writers, you confronted your mother's or your father's blind spots by saying like, oh, this was a cringeworthy moment, or a moment where I wish they would have thought differently. But I wondered, as writers, how do any of us, how do any of us check for that? How do we, Like, do you have trusted readers you share things with when you're writing about really sensitive, difficult material? Do you kind of go back to the reading that you've done and the education that you've embarked on yourself to make sure that that you're addressing those things? This was one of those complicated questions I kind of wanted to sink into a little.
Well, I was writing this book during the last 8 years. I mean, the book took 7, but then there's the year of birthing, publishing. Mm-hmm. And I was teaching at the new school, and our program was getting more and more diverse, and we were getting more and more open, students and teachers, about talking about these issues, and what was going on in the newspaper was going on in the newspaper, in the world. And I was very aware that the book, I became aware that the book I was writing was also a book for now. Mm-hmm. That my mother was a very intuitive, deep thinker, and she was not a kind of politician, civil rights kind of person. And she, and I think that's what we need now. We need nuance. Mm. And so I was sort of learning, being reminded and learning from her as I began to see her real struggles with these kinds of issues. And I was thinking, this is what I need to be doing. I need to be struggling with these issues, and we all need to be struggling with these issues now. And so there was that. I do have different, I have friends of color, and I have students of color, and I have Jewish friends, and I have older friends and younger friends, and I have, the woman, one of the main correspondences in the book is between my mother and her friend Pam Morton, who is now the widow of Jim Morton, who was for many years the dean of St. John the Divine and made St. John the Divine into that amazing place it remains. He just died. And so I could check in with her. I did check, and I checked in with my own sort of cringe barometer, and I kept learning, Mm-hmm. But I have to say that I was, sort of grateful for my hair is a mess.
Oh, it looks great.
I'm grateful for the experience of writing this book during this time, and grateful to remember things that had happened, and to learn that I had not been idealizing mm-hmm. certain things about the past. I mean, there's a lot that we haven't covered in this conversation. There's the death of Martin Luther King, and there's his speech coming out against the war, and there's my mother's my mother's participation in the McCarthy campaign, her presence in Los Angeles when Robert Kennedy was shot. And there are a lot of, I'm able to track her through that because she left a record with letters and diaries and letters to me. And so it's pretty on the ground, that part. Yeah. I tell the history through her. So,
well, and that she's such an inspiring example, and I think you're absolutely right. Her activism and her sincere belief in living what she believed at all costs is so inspiring. And the end wouldn't mean as much if you weren't willing to go into that really difficult stuff in the beginning, that you even would insert yourself and say, oh, this makes me uncomfortable. You call that out. And I think because we're following you, I just think that's such a beautiful way of addressing the complexity of this story. And the final thing I wanted to mention was that moment where you say, as so often happens, a chance event appears mm-hmm. just when the writer needs it. And I wonder, is there one chance event you would be willing to share with us that happened for you in the writing of this book?
Yes. Like toward close to the end, and I thought I had read and reread these letters and diary entries and everything over and over and over again. And one day I was at this office I was working in, and I went through the papers, and then there was this line, and I was in the chapter first person singular, and it said, in her writing, she wrote it, always before I had been we, now I was I. And it was like, boing, and it was like one of those things where I knew that. I mean, there is something that happens with these books. You know things, but it's very helpful to have the person herself say it, you know.
Well, I wonder if you would read the very last passage.
Okay, I will.
Share with us. Thank you.
We thought it was amazing that she had planned the funeral, the hymns, that bread and wine would be passed by her children, the feast and agape rather than communion, and therefore open to all. My sister Rosie and I bought huge baskets and red and blue linen napkins, peasant bread, and an abundance of plastic cups. 600 people filled the nave of the National Cathedral from Washington, Jersey City, New York. Dorothy Day came, and Margaret, her mother, arrived late in a wheelchair, swathed in black lace. My father couldn't believe it, upstaging her own daughter's funeral. The night before the service, we had all gathered in the living room to hear the will. Steve Pollock, the lawyer, slowly reading, had gotten through the paintings and jewelry. But just as he was reading the sentence in which my mother left the balance of her money, including royalties of her book, to support young writers, the raucous celebratory mood was broken when Patience, my youngest sister, still a little girl at 11, ran into the room crying, screaming with something that sounded like terror. Lucy, the yellow lab, had just given birth on her beautiful sheets and coverlet, my mother's final present to her. There was blood everywhere, 3 puppies, and we hadn't known the dog was pregnant. Never a dull moment, I could hear my mother saying, her laugh vibrating, her gorgeous smile. I promised Patience I would buy her another set of sheets exactly the same the next day, and I did. Someone comforted her, and the reading resumed. Mr. Pollock soon reached the passage in which my mother left me her writing. It seems that I misremembered. I was not alone in the bequest. Her teacher, Claessens, and I were meant to work together, but though we swore to for years, we could never bear to talk about it. We lived in different cities, and then he died in his 60s. What I found when at last I went systematically through the papers was that there was no manuscript that could make a complete book, nor was her play quite finished. Maybe I hadn't really been resisting all these years, just trying to figure out what to do. What I had done, dear reader, dear mom, was first to become a writer myself. Wasn't that what you wanted from me? As for your writing, I never stopped thinking about it. When I started this book, your book, I asked for your help and you gave it to me. In the writing you left, confiding everything I wanted to know. And as I wrote, I felt you falling away from my old ideas of you, my overemphasis on your sadness and discouragement. My loss of you released itself like an old skin. Isn't it strange that it's taken so long, all the way into my 70s, for me to feel that I am finally your daughter, prepared to inherit what you offered, stumbling as you did toward what I so awkwardly wanted all these years, to accept how you lived, how you kept changing, to understand that each new phase of your life was not a static place like a step on the Currier and Ives life and age of woman, but one chrysalis of many from which you kept emerging. I was always going to call the last portion of the book Revolution, but like you, with the ending of The People on 2nd Street, a title for the book kept eluding me. I was writing in a room in the Adirondacks with a fire going in September 2018, entirely off the grid, and my consciousness was fully with you. I was in the room where I remember you most vividly at cocktails before supper, the very interesting chatter, cheese and crackers and decoratively colored cut radishes. After supper, there would be Scrabble or liar's dice, charades or conversation. How in the New York Times this or that had happened, and how did we think that would affect? In the present, it was before lunch, and one of my guests, also a writer, came into the room. I looked down at the typed word, revolution, and saw that I'd scribbled hour above it. What do you think? I asked my friend, repeating the phrase. She was smiling at me. I would call the final section Our Revolution to allow for the changes of those years. And then I knew it was also the title of the book. I'd suddenly understood that I wanted to account for you, continually changing, encouraging others to keep moving and noticing. How alive you were, how you were not alone in your revolution, your turning, but part of a generation of mothers, a generation of women. And then I draw into focus on you, a white, privileged woman in a century of change who sought to take her place in movement forward. You gave me that, a kind of force within that never allows me to stay still.
Thank you so much, Honor. You end basically promising us the next book. Will you tell us what it is?
What?
Will you tell us what
it will be? Poems first. I have a book of poems almost finished, but I have to write another book, but these take too long. I have to figure out a way to do something that doesn't take quite as long, because if it took 12 years like all these have, I'd be 86.
That's just okay.
You don't have any idea what
we'll wait. Anyway. Well, I wonder if any of our loyal viewers have questions for us. I think they'll feed in through the chat if they do. But while we're waiting for those, I just want to say that phrase, "my consciousness is fully with you," that reverberated off the page for me, and I felt like those moments that happened infrequently, but sometimes so strongly in the book, were really palpable and beautiful. And I feel like that last passage is such a beautiful answer to the question, why did you wait until this moment to write this book? That you had to you had to go through all of the work you've done as a writer to get to the point where you could tackle this. So thank you for doing it and for producing this really tremendous achievement. It's such an important book.
Thank you, Laura, and all of you for being here and for seeing me, my beautiful new school community, and the rest of you out there. And my thesis students and my class, just so you know, I'm still here.
So it looks like we don't have any questions yet. We'll wait another minute or two. We might have just answered all of their questions, Honor. You might have done it.
I saw some chats up there.
Well, it was just adoration and praise. People letting you know how much they're enjoying your reading. But so was there anything else? I know I had a million other questions, but I'll just give it one more minute.
Well, I really can't express enough how grateful I am that we're able to continue community. There's somebody saying something.
There's a question coming. Go ahead. You finish that, and then I'll let you know what the question is.
Just how much we need community now, and how grateful I am for Zoom and however we did this.
It is incredible that
for our wonderful tech director, Dan Winkler.
Yes. Thank you.
And everyone in the office, Ben Fama, Lori Lynn Turner, you, Luis Jaramillo, our director.
Justin Sherwood and Christina Buzzolero. So we have a question. Don Granum asks, what was the most challenging part of writing this book and the most rewarding part?
Challenging was continuing because this book is the Bishop's Daughter, for instance, seemed to have one trajectory. I sort of knew the story. I mean, I didn't know the story, but I knew the trajectory. In this, it was sort of each time, women, that first they're like the Currier and Ives thing, there are stages. And in the case of my mother, each period of her life was another story. So that was very challenging. And the other challenging thing was integrating her writing into the book. And rewarding the whole thing was amazingly rewarding. Just getting my mother back, that's the main thing that was rewarding. I feel I have her back, and very rewarding is that some of my siblings are feeling that also. And my niece, one of my nieces who didn't know her, wrote me this text saying, "I'm so happy you wrote this book. Now I'm even more regret that I never knew my grandmother."
What a gift to the family.
It's wonderful. Yeah. I have 30 nephews and nieces, just so you know.
Maybe they're out there. Hi, honors.
Hi.
So we have a question from Brady Huguet, who's an
Hug it.
I'm sorry. He's wondering what new information you learned about your family while doing this research, and if you can give us an example.
New information. I would say the main new information I learned, I maybe realized is a better word, about my mother was that she didn't start out of nowhere being a writer, when she wrote her book, which is what I thought. I knew she wrote a million letters. She was like a maniac letter writer. She would have loved email and texting. But then I wouldn't have these letters. But I realized that she had a talent as a writer to begin with, and that she returned to that. And in that way, she was kind of I'm sure there are a lot of other women who were like that, of that generation, who were, sent into the kitchen and, in the post-war, lock the mothers and have a lot of children and lock them in the kitchen. And, at least suburban white women that happened for, and realizing that she had a life throughout, the writer, a talent and it was wonderful that she was able to realize it even briefly.
So we're running short on time, but I'm just going to ask two more questions. One is from Stacy. Is it Waddle or Waddell, who says, "Do you remember my mother, Dorothy Gill?"
Yes.
The family home.
She's in the book, Stacy. But no.
That's wonderful. And
Stacy's an artist, I believe. Yes, you're a visual artist.
We probably aren't going to have time
to get her answer anyway.
We'll have to get it. I think there's so many more questions, and I'm afraid we are going to have to wrap it up. But
we can't go till 8. They promised we could go till 8.
Well, we'll get one more. Let's see. Okay. Melissa in our program is wondering if you can talk a little bit about what it's like to speculate and imagine the lives of characters who are real people.
Well, you can't do it out of whole cloth. You have to have some evidence or something to start from. Somehow what came into my mind is that moment in To the Lighthouse when you see Mrs. Ramsey's glove shaped like her hand on the sofa. You have to have at least a glove shaped by the person's hand to be able to imagine the hand, if you know what I mean.
Oh, that's such a helpful metaphor.
Yeah.
Okay, there are just so many questions. We'll get a couple of more. I guess we can go until 8, but I also want to be respectful of people's not glazing out on too much screen time. So this was something that I wondered about too. About this question is coming from Paula. It's either Mate or Mate, about some of the writers who influenced you, but especially this realm of nonfiction you're working in, where you're combining biography and memoir. Could you say something about writers who've been helpful to you?
Well, I would say Margot Jefferson's book Negroland was really inspiring because of her truth-telling and because of her boldness in being herself, race, class, privilege, all of those elements. Long ago, I read a book called Common Ground by J. Anthony Lucas, which was about the entire community of Boston during the busing struggles for racial integration with busing. And that was a great, that's long ago that I read it, but I've never forgotten it. But I have to say that I sort of was, what do you say, swimming without a net, walking a tightrope without a tightrope. I didn't have too many examples because I do think that I have support from colleagues who, like Robert Polito, were always saying, be hybrid, mix it up, and we talk about that. But I think this is going to happen more and more, that people are going to be mixing things up. And another way to think about this work of mine and my work is as part of a great movement in the memoir, which has morphed into something called life writing. And so you have Knausgaard and so on who are working this way.
Ooh, I really want to meet you for tea when all of this is over and talk about that. One more question. I even got a text to make sure that I ask you this question. This is from Elizabeth Benedict, and she asks if you would tell the story of the policeman stopping you.
Oh, so I'm in Martha's Vineyard and I'm finishing the book, and literally I'm finishing the book, and my mother dies. I mean, I kill my mother, or I write that she's dead, something. And I'm just a wreck. I'm kind of crying, and I call a friend, my friend Carol, who lives like a 20-minute drive. And I say, I just finished. Can I please come over? And I get in the car and I start driving up the road, and I get up the road, and, a policeman, the lights, and I stop, and he says, we've gotten some calls. I mean, people, you've been going back and forth over the yellow lines. Are you okay? And I said, well, he said, is there anything? I said, are you okay? And I said, I looked at him, and literally this lovely, wide-faced person, and he looked like 16. I mean, he was a policeman, so he's probably 26, but I thought, I am never going to be able to explain all this to him. He's never going to get that just writing about your mother's dying could make you feel that she just died. And so I said, well, my mother just died. And he gave me a warning and said, now, is there anyone we can call? Are you okay? I said, I'm just going to my friend's house. So that's the story. So he just gave me a warning.
Well, thank you so much, Honor. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us and for your fabulous questions.
Thank you very much.
And I forgot to mention, but I have to mention, please buy the book. There's a link in the event description to buy the book. If you go to honormore.com, you can buy the book. This is such a beautiful book and such a beautiful gift to mothers and daughters in your lives. So thank you so much, Honor. We're so grateful. And I'm going to applaud. And I encourage everyone out there to applaud.
You're going to get to see the video again, you lucky people.
Oh, that's right. We're going to watch the video. So we'll let Dan cue that up for us. Thank you again.
Thank you all for coming. Really, this was wonderful.